In this video, we're going to go over hosting your Django project on a VPS. We'll go through installing Postgres, nginx, and uwsgi. Then configure all of them to work together to host your site. In another video, we're going to go over deployment and management of the server. In this one, we're just going to go over getting it up and running. To get this working, we're going to install the GoDjango site on a virtual server I have on my local network. But it should work very similar to having it on Linode or some other VPS. This server configuration is based on Ubuntu 13.10, so we're going to use apt-get to install all of our dependencies, and then we're going to use Ubuntuisms, as I call it, with managing your server. First thing we're going to do is install PostgreSQL. We're going to start it by doing an apt-get install. I used to think installing and running it was hard and complicated until one day I realized it really isn't once you understand what you're doing, and the following steps should be fairly simple and will be in the show notes. With Ubuntu, we're just installing it, and then we're setting a password for the Postgre user that Ubuntu creates for us for this package. We follow that up with creating a database, and we'll use the command line utility that comes with Postgres. And now that we have our database, we need to create a user that can actually do stuff with the database. We will log in to pSQL and create our new role, which is what Postgre refers to as a user, followed shortly by granting all the privileges to the database. At this point, I want to take a moment now and mention that anything I do here is to the value of showing you how to do this and not the best security way to do it. As an example, it would be best to have a user that only has basic data CRUD operations, and that's what you use in your production application. And then whenever you actually need to run your syncdb and migrations, you use a different user that has the ability to drop and add tables. And with all of that in mind, all of that run, we are ready to go and we're done setting up our database. Next, we have to install setup tools for Python and install a couple of other build dependencies for when we do a pip install and it wants to install native binaries. Once the install is done, we are ready to install virtual environment, which is an easy install away. Now we need to install nginx and uwsgi. Nginx is what we use to accept requests from the internet and route them to where they need to go. With Ubuntu, it is as easy as apt-get install nginx. uwsgi is what we use to run our Django applications and tell nginx where to access our running WSGI instance. We need to install the normal uwsgi and the Python plugin for it as well, so we can run our Django application. uwsgi runs our Django project similarly to when you do a run server command, but it does it more robustly and with a lot more features. Now that we have everything installed, we're actually ready to get our code and start wiring up everything. We're going to have everything in var dub. We're going to have a VN folder, and we're also going to have an application folder here in a bit that's going to house our Django code. In the VN folder is where we're going to have our virtual environments, and then we're going to configure uwsgi to use the virtual environment accordingly in this folder. So let's actually start with our virtual environment. We're going to create it, and then we're actually going to edit the virtual environment's activate file. Not actually sure a good way to set environment variables for different environments based on the project, so I just go ahead and edit the activate file and add my appropriate environment variables. In this case, I'm adding in environment variables that I have set in the GoDjango application for whether it's a production environment or not. I also have variables for all of the connection information for our database. That way, those particular pieces of credentials don't actually make it into the Git repository. And this is actually a proper way of configuring your application based on the 12-factor app approach, which I'll link to in the show notes. So with our environment variables set, we're going to activate our environment and move on to our code. The next couple steps are actually going to be very easy, and we do them all the time. We'll check out from a Git repository the GoDjango code. Then we simply are going to cdn Do our pip install and install all of our requirements. And then we're going to do a sync db and a migrate. And then finally we're going to do a collect static to get all of our static files into one location. And after all that's done, our environment is pretty much set up between virtual environment and our actual application. Finally, we are to the good stuff, configuring nginx and uwsgi. Before we do that though, I want to talk about a couple of things and how Ubuntu handles configuration and management of services. Since all Linux configuration is stored in /etc, there is a /etc nginx and a /etc uwsgi. The convention that Ubuntu follows is that if you want to have a configuration file for a site, then it will be stored in an available folder. Then when you enable the site, you symlink it to an enabled folder. So for nginx, there is a sites available in /etc/nginx/sites available. We add our configuration to that location, and then we do a symlink of that to /etc/nginx/sites enabled folder. That will enable that site for nginx when we restart the service, or it starts from a boot. This is so that we can easily disable our site without having to name it something funky or delete it and lose our configuration. Also, Postgres, nginx, and uwsgi are started by Ubuntu by default, so by enabling them on startup of the server, they will both start and be ready for you to use. So if your server ever reboots or you need to do a reboot yourself, it will automatically start up and you are good to go. The last note is that all of our services that are started and run by Ubuntu that deals with the web are all running as www data. So we will need to make sure our virtual environment and application code are all owned by www data. Now let's create our nginx configuration file. First we want to declare that this is a server level configuration block. Next we tell nginx to listen on port 80, and anything coming into the server on that port, nginx will respond accordingly. We're giving it a server name of localhost, so if we type in localhost locally, it will work. This is also where you would put the name of your site as well. Next comes the interesting part. We are telling the server that at the location of the root of the website, signified by the /, we want to pass off all of those requests to uwsgi using the uwsgi configuration parameter. And we not only want to pass it off, but we want to pass it to a Unix socket. This could be an HTTP address with a port. I just chose to use Unix socket instead. The final part of the location is to include uwsgi params, but I really wouldn't worry about what this does for now, just know that you need it. The next location that we're going to deal with is the /static. This is where we are going to serve up all of our static files from when we did our collect static command. It dumped it to the static_final folder. We are defining this so that nginx handles the return of images, CSS, and JavaScript instead of having to add it to the overhead of doing it inside of our Django application. So now if someone requests a static file, nginx handles it instead of Django. And that's really all there is for configuring nginx. The only final thing we have to do is enable the site with a simple symlink. Now finally it's time to configure uwsgi to host our Django application. First we need to create our configuration any file. Since this is a configuration file, we start with uwsgi in brackets. This is going to be a vhost, so we're going to set it to true. We're running a Python application, so we're going to set plugins to Python. We're going to use a Unix socket, so we're giving it a location of a Unix socket. The next three things you can just go ahead and add. WSGI file is where we're going to have our wsgi.py file that's in our Django application. Virtual env is the location of our virtual environment that we set up earlier. Change directory is where we're going to change the directory as we run our application. In this case, the root of the website. So whenever you have your base dir configuration in your settings, it sets up to the right location instead of just some random place. Touch reload is where we're going to set a file that every time we touch it or it gets updated, then it's going to, uwsgi is going to reload and re-execute all of the Python in that location. This will become more apparent as to why you need it in another video when we talk about deployment. Finally, we're going to set our environment variables for our application. We set earlier the environment variables in the activate script. This was for setting environment variables for when we're in the shell and we're trying to do stuff. In this case, we're setting the environment variables in our configuration file for when we actually execute each request. And that's really all there is for our uwsgi configuration. The only thing we need to do now is we need to change the folders and the files to a www data user doing a chown. We also need to enable our uwsgi application by doing a symlink. And then finally we need to restart our services. And once that's done, we're actually ready to demo. Now for our demo, we're going to go to our IP address of our virtual server. And there we go, it comes up. Go to the About page, and then we'll go back home. Everything seems to work well. If you look at the images on the side, you'll actually see that we have our static assets working correctly as well.